morning, everybody. It's chapter 16, The Rat Trap. Scrambling out of the sewer, they replaced the manhole cover and snuck out back of the Emporium. They entered base camp, and Darker saw one of the strings of the bottle tops was jangling. "It's the rat trap," Bertolt said as Newton flew up to join his cousins on the ceiling. Virginia ran her finger over the map on the wardrobe. "The one by the wall?" Bertolt nodded. "What should we do?" "If it's Humphrey or Pickering, we should leave them in there," Virginia said. "It'll make moving the mountain easier." "It's probably a fox," Darker said, seeing the frightened look on Bertolt's face. "There's only one way to find out," Virginia said, running back out of the door and falling to her knees. As they crept towards the rat trap, Bertolt whispered, "Surely Humphrey couldn't get into the furniture forest. He's too big. It must be Pickering." "If it is, let's tie him up and tape over his mouth," Darker said, thinking about the time he'd spent tied to a chair. Suddenly, Baxter leapt off his shoulder and zoomed forwards. "Shh!" Virginia put her fingers to her lips. They could hear a man struggling and cursing. Baxter landed and crawled along the top of the rat trap, flicking his elytra in the air. Virginia silently climbed up onto a chest of drawers and peered down into the trap. "Whoops!" She clamped her hand over her mouth. "Who is it?" Bertolt whispered. "Hello? Is someone there?" "It's Uncle Max!" exclaimed Darkus, scrambling up beside Virginia. "Darkus?" Uncle Max peered at them. "Is that you? Get me out of here!" "Oh gosh, Professor Cuttle, I'm so sorry," Bertolt exclaimed. "How did you get in there?" Darkus asked. "I was trying to find you. Ouch! I need to talk to you about... Ah!" He sucked in his breath. "Blasted things are biting me." "We'll have you out of there in a second, Professor Cuttle," Virginia said. "Please stop struggling." "Stop struggling? There's a plague of rats in here." Uncle Max looked at Darkus. "I saw you three climb over the wall the other day, and I thought you might have made a den over here, so I came looking for you, which, in hindsight, was a terrible idea. I've been stuck in here for at least an hour." Darkus jumped down and helped Bertolt to move aside a mirrored panel and unlock the gate that had swung shut and trapped Uncle Max. "They're tame rats," Bertolt explained, "from a pet shop. You must have frightened them." "I frightened them?" Uncle Max pointed to the dead rats hanging down on strings around his face. "What about these poor chaps?" "I found them in the basement of our block of flats," Bertolt smiled apologetically. "They were already dead from poison. I put them in to scare an intruder." "Well, they certainly gave me a turn," Uncle Max huffed, crawling out of the cage. "They smell awful." "I do apologise, Professor Cuttle," Bertolt stammered. "They weren't meant for you." "Thank heavens!" Uncle Max sat up on his knees and smiled at the worried Bertolt. "Jolly good trap, though. Not quite up to the Egyptian tomb standards, but nonetheless pretty impressive." He looked at the children's guilty faces. "So is somebody going to tell me what's going on here, or do I have to guess?" Virginia nudged Darkus, who was staring at the floor. "Your neck's bleeding." Uncle Max took Darkus by his shoulders. "It's fine, I had a splinter," Darkus replied, covering the cut on his neck with his hand. Would you like to come back to our camp for a cup of tea, Professor Cuttle?" Bertolt asked politely. "It might soothe your nerves and we can explain everything there." "A camp, eh?" Uncle Max straightened his safari hat. "Don't mind if I do." They set off through the tunnels on their hands and knees, Baxter flying in front, leading the way. "This place is a rabbit warren," Uncle Max exclaimed as they inched forward. "It's a good job archaeologists are used to confined spaces." "I'm sorry, Professor Cuttle, but we need to be quiet," Virginia whispered. "We don't know when Pickering and Humphrey will get back." "Apologies," Uncle Max whispered back. "Understood." As they all filed through the door of base camp, Uncle Max whistled in amazement at the throbbing glow of fireflies reflected in the chandelier crystals dangling from the ceiling. "This is quite a setup you've got here," he remarked, as Bertolt plugged a portable kettle into the car battery. "Most of this stuff was already here," Darkus said. "Apart from the kettle," Virginia added. "That's Bertolt's." Uncle Max gazed up at the ceiling in wonder. "Where have all these beetles come from?" Darkus looked at Virginia but didn't reply. Baxter settled on his shoulder. Uncle Max saw the map on the back of the wardrobe and wandered over, inspecting the collection of images around the words Lucretia Cutter. He touched the edge of Novak's card. "Do you take milk or sugar?" Bertolt asked. "Black, 6 sugars. Thank you, Bertolt." Uncle Max turned to face Darkus, his voice suddenly serious. "I think you'd better tell me exactly what's going on here, lad, don't you?" Darkus, Virginia and Bertolt looked at each other. "And no flim-flam, please." Uncle Max took his cup of tea from Bertolt and sat down on the sofa. "I want the truth." There was an awkward silence in which Uncle Max took a mouthful of tea. "I found Dad," Darkus said. Uncle Max sprayed his tea across the table. "What?" he spluttered. "Lucretia Cutter has him, in a cell, in the basement of our house," Darkus said hurriedly. "How do you know that?" Uncle Max was on his feet. "By Jupiter, please tell me you've been there." His face was flushed purple and his eyes were bulging out of their sockets. Darcus looked guiltily at Virginia and Bertolt, then nodded. "Did she see you?" Darcus nodded again, wondering if Uncle Max was about to have a heart attack. "She shot at me, but she missed," he said. "That's how I got the splinter." "She shot at you?" Uncle Max paused, then dropped back down on the sofa and picked up his tea. "Well, that's a relief." "What?" Bertolt spluttered. "Why is that good?" "Because it means she doesn't know who he is," Uncle Max explained. "If Lucretia Cutter had recognised Darcus, she wouldn't have shot at him. She'd have kidnapped him and used him against Barty." Uncle Max shook his head. "I can't believe you'd be so stupid as to go into that Gorgon's house. You could have got yourself killed, and your father too." "What's a Gorgon?" Virginia whispered to Bertolt. "A monster woman who turns men to stone by looking at them," he replied under his breath. Darcus felt like he'd been slapped in the face. When he'd gone to towering heights, he hadn't meant to put himself or Dad at risk. How could he when he didn't even know Dad was there? Then another thought occurred to him. "You knew she had him all along," he gasped. "No, at least not until we went to the museum, and even then I had no real evidence." Uncle Max shook his head. "Her name over the door, that yellow ladybird, and her sudden arrival, these things are not enough to accuse someone of kidnapping." He sighed. "I've been trying to find out where she's keeping him. I thought he might be in her cosmetics factory in Wapping." He blinked. "I tried her offices and a string of warehouses on the Thames, but with no joy." "How?" Darcus asked. "When?" "I haven't been going to work," Uncle Max admitted, "and you may not believe this, but I do a rather convincing impersonation of a confused delivery man." He smiled. "I've got a blue boiler suit, a badge and a cardboard box. I wander into a building looking lost and start asking questions. People can be astonishingly helpful, you know." He tugged on his earlobe. "I must admit it didn't occur to me that she'd have him at her house. The nerve! She must be very confident she won't get caught." "But why didn't you tell me?" Darcus asked angrily. "Darcus, I didn't have any proof that Lucretia Cutter had Barty. Just a hunch. I was looking for evidence." Darcus glared at his uncle. "But today I thought I should pursue a different line of inquiry. Instead of trying to find out where Lucretia Cutter has Barty, I decided to try and find out why she has him. And that's why I came looking for you. I need to talk to you about your friend." He pointed at Baxter. "I need to know more about your beetles." He lifted his hands up, gesturing to the fireflies. Darcus wasn't listening. He was so angry his whole body was shaking. "You've been keeping secrets from me." "No, Darcus, I haven't," Uncle Max said softly. "I wanted to be sure of the facts before I told you anything that might get your hopes up. Barty is in grave danger." He watched as Darcus struggled with what he was hearing. "I'm here now, aren't I?" Darcus nodded, his teeth clenched. "What about you?" Uncle Max raised an eyebrow. "Haven't you been keeping a few secrets of your own?" Darcus looked at the floor. "I didn't tell you the whole truth about how I found Baxter," he admitted. "I thought you'd make him give me back." "Well, how about you tell me now?" Okay, back for part 2 in a moment.